Okay, let's wrap up our discussion of innate immunity, second line of defenses, by looking at inflammation and fever. Inflammation is an immune response to infection or some other trauma. I've always found that odd. Right? You can get an infection in your ankle and it'll swell up. You can twist your ankle and it'll swell up. Okay, so it's an immune response to infection or some other trauma, like a physical trauma. And there are three features to inflammation that we believe make it beneficial. Vasodilation, increased vessel permeability. Vasodilation means the blood vessels at the site of inflammation are going to be larger, they're going to be dilated and opened up. Think about that. That means more blood flow to the site of the infection. More blood flow then means more complement, more antibodies, in other words, better opsonization overall, more phagocytic white blood cells, more tissue repair enzymes in cells. All those features can get to the site of the infection better if the vessel is dilated. You can also get a lot more nutrients like glucose and oxygen to the site of the infection. All this activity at the site of the infection requires a ton of oxygen, just for the general maintenance and function of all these cells that are working, but also for the oxidative burst that's so critical to the killing step of phagocytosis. If you don't remember that, go back to the earlier videos on phagocytosis and watch those again. That killing step includes not only production of hydrolytic enzymes to degrade macromolecules, but also a lot of reactive oxygen species, that oxidative burst. And that demands a lot of O2 to create those. So inflammation and infection fighting is a high oxygen demanding process. So that vasodilation seems to assist in that. Increased vessel permeability assists in diapedesis as well. If you don't remember diapedesis, go back and look at some of our discussion of phagocytosis again, and wandering macrophages as an example. You've got these monocytes that are cruising through the bloodstream that detect some kind of a chemoattractant saying, hey, there's an infection here. You know, you're on the freeway, it's time to exit. And so the way they exit is by crawling through the blood vessel wall. The more permeable the blood vessel wall becomes, the easier it is for these components to leak out into the site of the infection. So vasodilation and increased vessel permeability really are hallmarks of inflammation. And it's that vasodilation and increased permeability that leads to the swelling associated with inflammation. Number 2, influx of phagocytes. And number 3, tissue repair. Inflammation seems to be involved in all of these things. If you're in the nursing program or if you've taken advanced first aid of some kind, then you should be familiar with the signs and symptoms of inflammation: redness, pain, heat, and swelling. Those 4 are worth memorizing and becoming really familiar with, so you can always recognize inflammation when it's in front of you. The swelling isn't always as obvious as you'd like it to be. As an example of how important inflammation can be to healing, you guys know that I just had some shoulder work done. And one of the things that my surgeon said was no anti-inflammatory meds like ibuprofen for at least 3 weeks. He wanted to be sure that the tissue repair cells and tissue repair enzymes all had the opportunity to get to the site of the infection, and we could have the most effective tissue repair going on. I realize that's not an infection, but we said inflammation is also important for physical trauma, and a shoulder surgery certainly counts as physical trauma. I can attest to that. And then the second generalized category here I want to talk about is fever, which is, we're all familiar with fever. A systemic response to infection or intoxication results in a high body temperature. Intoxication doesn't mean drunk, right? It doesn't mean that wild weekend in Ensenada and you're going to have a fever, though you might for other reasons. Intoxication means microbial toxins, bacterial toxins being produced that can stimulate fever. Infection in general can stimulate fever. Most viral infections, except for maybe the common cold, tend to stimulate fever as well. Fever is debatable in terms of its value overall. There are folks that say you've got to let a fever run its course, and there are others that say no, the fever is not particularly useful. Our patient's comfort and therefore mental state and physical state are going to be more important in the recovery process. And that's something you're going to have to sort through and come up with some hopefully evidence-based decisions of your own. What do we know fever does, though? We know that interferon, this important antiviral cytokine, seems to be more intense in its activity, seems to be produced at higher levels and more effective at slightly elevated temperatures. Even phagocytes and lymphocytes seem to work a little bit better at slightly elevated temperatures. And even the enzymes involved in tissue repair seem to function, at least some of them, at slightly higher temperatures. Number 4 is quite speculative, but you still hear people speculating about this, that it sets the body to a non-optimal temperature for the microbes. Let's say you've got a Pseudomonas infection and Pseudomonas loves 37 degrees, and you bump up your body temp to 38 or 39, isn't that going to sort of smoke out the Pseudomonas? Well, maybe, but it's also going to smoke you out in the process too, because you're optimized for 37 degrees, with the exception of maybe a few of these other immune functions. And so it's not necessarily a strong argument that setting the body to the non-optimal microbial temperature is effective in getting rid of those microbes. Now, I said earlier that it's important that as healthcare providers, you make evidence-based decisions. If we were to just look at these activities here and say, oh, well, fever does all these things, therefore, I'm going to, as a healthcare provider, always recommend that people let fever run its course. That would be a good hypothesis, because you've got good reason to think that maybe that's true. To draw a conclusion, though, you need data. Okay, conclusions are based on data. Hypotheses are based on good ideas. Make sure you can distinguish those two. The data seem to suggest that there's no statistical difference between letting a fever run its course and interrupting the fever with things like ibuprofen in terms of recovery. If that's true, if those data are solid, if that's true, then the conclusion we might want to draw is that we should probably keep our patients comfortable and not let fever run its course if the benefits are so low that we can't even detect an improvement overall. But that's something you're going to have to look into, you're going to have to think about as a scientist and a healthcare provider on your own. Let's finish this whole discussion of the innate immune system with 2 concept checks. So in order to do this by video, you're just going to need to pause them after you finish or while you're working on them, and then start the video again to go on to the next one. And I'd prefer you do this in pairs or groups. So you can try on your own, but you'd be better off grabbing a buddy and saying, hey, let's work this out. So working in pairs, this is what we would do if we were in class together. Diagram the pathway that a cold virus, let's say it's a rhinovirus, would take in its attempts to cause an infection. Start at the very, very beginning. It's outside. Where is it? How does it get in? What are the portals of entry? All the way through actually causing infection. Indicate during this process, in your diagram here, the innate barriers that it would encounter in its quest. So go ahead and click pause and work on this one. Okay, I'm going to move now to the second concept check. Do the same thing, this time with a bacterial pathogen. Diagram the pathway that a dose of salmonella would take in its attempt to cause an infection, and indicate the innate barriers that it would encounter in its quest. The implication here is that our innate defenses might be a little different with a viral infection and a bacterial infection. Work your way through both of these, talk them through, and make sure they're both clear in your minds. I hope these videos on innate immunity were helpful to you, and the next video series is going to be on our adaptive response, assuming a pathogen has gotten past our innate defense.